The greatest distance in a family is not miles on a map, it is the silence that grows between hearts sitting at the same table. Margaret Wilson had never been afraid of work. Work, in many ways, was what kept her alive. It filled her days, steadied her hands, and gave her a purpose when everything else around her seemed to fray. She was 50 years old, and while most of her peers in the neighborhood were slowing down, talking about early retirement or vacations on the coast, Maggie was racing from one job to another. By morning, she worked as a receptionist at a small dental clinic, smiling through patients' complaints and scheduling endless cleanings. By evening, she tied her apron at a local diner, balancing trays of burgers and black coffee for truckers who never looked her in the eye. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. And steady, to Maggie, meant survival. Her house sat in a quiet corner of a suburban town outside Chicago, a modest two-story with peeling paint on the shutters and a lawn she tried to mow on Sundays if the weather allowed. To outsiders, it looked plain, maybe even forgettable. But for Maggie, it was a fortress, the last tangible thing she had fought for after her divorce 15 years ago. Inside that house lived her children, Emily, 22, bright-eyed and sharp-tongued, a law student at Northwestern University, and Josh, 17, still in high school, lanky and restless, always caught between boyhood and manhood. They were her reason for everything. Every early morning shift, every late night sore ankle, every sigh she let out when she balanced the bills at the kitchen table, it was all for them. She believed, perhaps too much, that sacrifice was the purest form of love. That evening, the smell of roast chicken filled the house. Maggie had managed to leave the diner early, a rare gift. She hummed softly as she set the table. 3 plates, neatly folded napkins, a small vase with a single daisy plucked from the yard. She wanted dinner to feel like it used to, years ago when the children were younger and the simple act of sharing food brought laughter instead of tension. Josh bounded down the stairs first, sneakers squeaking against the linoleum. He grabbed a roll before even sitting down. "Hey, Mom," he said with a grin, cheeks already stuffed. "Wait for your sister," Maggie reminded him gently. Emily appeared a moment later, her laptop tucked under her arm, phone buzzing in her pocket. She looked exhausted, her hair pulled into a bun that had loosened with the day. Maggie's heart swelled. She saw herself in that face, but sharper, more determined. "Dinner's ready," Maggie said, pulling the chicken from the oven. "Thought we could all eat together tonight." Emily sat down, but not before checking her phone again. She scrolled quickly, her lips pressed tight, then set the device face down on the table. They began to eat. For a few blessed minutes, there was the sound of forks on plates, Josh's chatter about a basketball game, Maggie's reminders for him to finish his homework. She tried to ignore the silence radiating from Emily's end of the table. Finally, Emily looked up. Her eyes were cool, her voice flatter than Maggie expected. "Mom," she said, "I don't want to end up like you." The words struck like a plate shattering on the floor. Maggie froze, fork suspended midair. Emily continued, her tone steady, almost rehearsed. "I mean, I see you. You work yourself to the bone. 2 jobs, no vacations, no time for yourself. All you do is sacrifice. And for what? To scrape by? To be exhausted every single day? I don't want that. I won't." Josh's head snapped up, his jaw tight. "Emily, that's harsh." But Emily didn't waver. She stared at her mother as if demanding a confession. Maggie put her fork down slowly. Her hands trembled. She wanted to say 1,000 things about the mortgage, about the unpaid child support from their father, about the nights she stayed awake so her children could sleep peacefully. She wanted to tell Emily that love wasn't measured by vacations or bank accounts, but by the meals cooked, the shoes bought, the heat that never went out in winter. Instead, she swallowed. The words stuck in her throat like glass. "I know," Maggie said softly, eyes cast down at her plate. "I don't expect you to." The silence that followed was heavier than any storm. After dinner, Emily excused herself quickly, mumbling something about coursework. Josh lingered, frowning at his mother. "She doesn't mean it, Mom," he said. Maggie forced a smile. "She's young. She's supposed to dream of something better." Josh opened his mouth to argue, then closed it, defeated. He disappeared upstairs, leaving Maggie alone at the table. She sat there long after the plates had cooled, staring at the flickering candle she had lit in hope of warmth. Its flame trembled, small and fragile, just like her. In her heart, Maggie understood her daughter's words weren't born of cruelty, but of fear. Fear of inheriting a life built on endless giving, fear of drowning in obligations. Yet knowing this didn't make it hurt any less. She thought of her own mother, who had worked in a sewing factory until her fingers curled, who had whispered to Maggie at night, "We don't get to live for ourselves, we live for our children." Was that love, or was it a curse passed down like an heirloom? Maggie rose finally, collecting the plates in silence. She washed them carefully, the warm water running over her hands. When the last dish was placed on the rack, she turned off the light and let the kitchen fall into darkness. That night, lying awake in her bed, Maggie replayed Emily's words over and over. "I don't want to end up like you." She realized she had built her life like a wall, stone by stone, sacrifice by sacrifice, thinking it would protect her children. But walls don't just keep danger out, they also keep voices from reaching across. And sometimes, the wall between a mother and her children grows so tall, so silent, that neither side remembers how to climb over it. As the clock ticked past midnight, Maggie whispered into the quiet room, though no one could hear, "I only ever wanted you to feel safe." Her words dissolved into the darkness, unanswered, as the wall of silence stood higher than ever. The next morning, the house was unusually quiet. Maggie moved through the kitchen like a ghost, pouring coffee into her travel mug, slicing a banana for Josh's lunchbox. Upstairs, she could hear the faint shuffle of Emily getting ready for class. She almost called out, a simple "have a good day," but the words lodged in her throat. Last night's conversation still echoed in the air like smoke that refused to clear. By the time Emily came down, Maggie was lacing her shoes for her shift at the clinic. Josh sat at the counter chewing cereal, pretending not to notice the frost between his sister and his mother. "Bye, Mom," Emily said quickly, slinging her backpack over her shoulder. Her voice was polite, distant. Maggie looked up, offered a smile that never reached her eyes, and nodded. Josh frowned. "Seriously, Em," but Emily had already stepped out the door. That evening, Maggie returned from work exhausted, her feet sore from standing all day. Still, she set the table again, habit, hope, maybe both. She baked a small casserole, the kind Emily used to love when she was little. She told herself food could bridge the distance, that the warmth of a meal might soften her daughter's sharp words. When they finally sat down, the air was thick with unspoken things. Josh started rambling about a history project, his voice pitched higher than usual, trying to fill the silence. "Mrs. Carter assigned us this paper on civil rights, and you wouldn't believe how boring the textbook makes it sound. But I found this documentary." "That's nice," Emily interrupted flatly. She was scrolling through her phone beneath the table, screen glow reflected in her eyes. Josh rolled his eyes. "You could at least pretend to listen." "Pretend is all Mom ever does," Emily muttered, almost too softly to hear. Maggie's hand stiffened on her fork. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. She was tired of the sting but didn't want to ignite another fire. Josh, however, had no such restraint. "What is your problem? She works herself half to death for us and you act like she's the villain." Emily looked up sharply, her cheeks flushed. "Oh, so I'm supposed to clap every time she sacrifices? You think it's noble? I think it's sad. Other moms go to yoga, travel, actually live. Ours just slaves away and calls it love." The words landed heavy, cruel in their precision. Maggie felt them like darts. She wanted to protest, to remind her daughter that living costs money, that someone had to pay for Emily's textbooks, her rent, her very dream of becoming a lawyer. But she stayed silent, staring at the steam rising from the casserole, wishing she could vanish inside it. Josh slammed his fork down. "You're unbelievable." Emily's eyes narrowed. "You don't understand, Josh. You're still a kid. Wait until you're older, you'll see. I don't want to end up drowning in bills, working doubles, pretending that's some kind of strength." Maggie finally spoke, her voice low. "Enough." The table went still. Even Josh stopped mid-retort. Maggie rarely raised her voice. When she did, it carried weight. "Dinner is supposed to bring us together," she said, forcing calm. "If all we're going to do is tear each other apart, maybe we shouldn't sit at the same table." For a moment, no one moved. Then the front door opened with a click and the air shifted again. "Hello." A man's voice boomed from the hallway. Josh groaned. Emily's eyes lit up. It was David, her ex-husband, their father. David Wilson stepped into the dining room as if he still belonged there, though it had been years since he left. He wore an expensive gray suit, tie loosened just enough to suggest casual comfort, and his hair was touched with the kind of gray that made him look distinguished rather than old. "Kids," he said warmly, arms spread. "Look at you." Emily leapt from her chair and hugged him tightly. "Dad, what are you doing here?" Josh rose slower, giving a small nod. "Hey." Maggie stayed seated, her fork clenched, her body tense. David's presence had always unsettled the balance of the house. He carried with him not just memories, but comparisons, what he had, what she lacked. "I was in town for a meeting," David explained, smiling as he sat down uninvited. "Thought I'd drop by. Hope I'm not interrupting." Maggie forced a thin smile. "We were just finishing." David reached for a roll anyway, tearing it open with ease. "You kids should come by my place this weekend. Linda's been asking about you." At the mention of his new wife, Maggie felt the familiar stab of resentment. Linda, with her manicured nails and designer handbags, the woman who had slid seamlessly into the life Maggie once held. Emily's face brightened. "Really? I'd love to. Mom, that's okay, right?" Maggie swallowed hard. "You're old enough to decide where you spend your weekends." David chuckled, patting Emily's hand. "See? She understands. Emily, you'd love our new house. Big backyard, lots of light, and you should see the kitchen, state of the art. Perfect for entertaining." The words were daggers disguised as casual conversation. Maggie looked at her own kitchen with its cracked linoleum and second-hand appliances and felt the comparison burn. Josh shifted uncomfortably. "Sounds nice." "It is," David said, eyes twinkling. "You know, Em, you could move in with us while you finish school. Shorter commute, better study environment. You wouldn't have to, well, you know." His gaze flicked toward Maggie, and the unfinished sentence said everything. Emily hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Maybe I should." The silence that followed was deafening. Maggie sat frozen, her heart pounding. She knew she should say something, anything to stop the knife twisting deeper. But all she managed was a quiet, "if that's what you want." Josh pushed back his chair with a screech. "This is messed up." He stormed upstairs, leaving his plate half finished. David clapped his hands lightly as if to break the tension. "Well, I didn't mean to cause a scene, just think about it." Emily smiled faintly. "I will." As David left, Maggie gathered the plates with trembling hands. Her daughter's eyes avoided hers, fixed instead on the door where her father had just exited. And in that moment, Maggie felt it, the first real crack in the foundation she had built. Not from the weight of her own sacrifices, but from the widening gap between her children and the creeping suspicion that she was losing them both. That night, Maggie could not sleep. The dishes were washed, the house was silent, but her mind kept replaying the moment when Emily's eyes lit up at her father's words. It wasn't just excitement, it was relief, as though the weight of her mother's sacrifices had become a burden she couldn't wait to shed. Maggie lay awake staring at the ceiling. She thought of all the nights she had counted pennies at this very kitchen table, the credit card bills stacked like enemies in neat white envelopes. She thought of the checks she had signed for Emily's tuition, the ones that left her bank account trembling and her future mortgaged. She had always told herself it didn't matter what she lost, so long as her children gained. But tonight she wondered if, in giving everything, she had taught them to see her as nothing. The following afternoon, Maggie left her second job early. She drove not to the diner, but to the bank. The parking lot was nearly empty, the late sun casting long shadows over the pavement. She sat in her car for a full minute, gripping the steering wheel before finally forcing herself inside. The clerk recognized her. "Mrs. Wilson here again?" Maggie nodded, trying to smile. "Yes, I just need to check on the loan status." The woman pulled up the account on her computer, clicking through the files. "Still current, payments always on time." She gave Maggie a look of mild admiration. Not many manage that. Maggie exhaled, both proud and ashamed. Proud because she had never missed a payment, not once. Ashamed because Emily believed she had no control, that she was drowning. In truth, she was drowning, but she refused to let the water show above the surface. She left with a fresh printout in her bag. In bold letters at the top, home equity line of credit balance due, $62,417. That house, her fortress, was no longer fully hers. Piece by piece, she had traded it away to keep her children's future intact. That evening, Emily came home late, cheeks flushed from studying with classmates. Maggie waited at the table with the papers spread before her. She said carefully, can we talk? Emily looked wary but sat across from her. Sure, what's up? Maggie hesitated, then slid the statement across the table. Do you know what this is? Emily scanned it, frowning. A loan you borrowed against the house? Yes, Maggie admitted, her voice shook. For your tuition, for the rent near campus, for everything you needed to stay in law school. Emily's face hardened. Why didn't you tell me? Because I didn't want you to worry. Worry? Emily laughed bitterly. Mom, this isn't noble. This is reckless. You've put everything at risk, our home for me. That's not sacrifice. That's stupidity. The words cut deep, sharper than knives. Maggie's lips parted, but no defense came. Josh, who had been listening from the staircase, stormed into the kitchen. Don't talk to her like that. He snapped at Emily. You think Dad's paying for anything? You think Linda is? It's Mom, always Mom. You should be grateful, not? Stop, Maggie interrupted, her voice trembling. Both of you. But Emily was already standing, arms crossed, fury blazing in her eyes. Maybe Dad's right. Maybe I should move in with him and Linda. At least they live like real adults. Josh's fists clenched. Go ahead. Maybe you'll finally see what kind of man he is. Better than being trapped in this rundown house with a martyr, Emily spat before storming upstairs and slamming her door. The silence afterward was suffocating. Josh dropped into a chair, his chest heaving. Maggie stared at the bank papers spread before her, each number a reminder of the life she had built, the choices she had made. And for the first time, she wondered if Emily was right, if sacrifice, carried too far, could become its own kind of sin. The next morning, a thick envelope arrived in the mailbox. The return address made Maggie's stomach tighten. Law offices of Bradley and Cole. She tore it open with shaking hands. Inside was a letter stamped with her ex-husband's signature. David Wilson was petitioning for a division of assets. He wanted the house. Maggie sank onto the porch steps, the letter trembling in her hands. She thought of the bank loan, the overdue bills, Emily's contempt. And now David, coming back for the last thing she still called hers. Her fortress was under siege, and she was running out of weapons. The letter lay on the kitchen table like a weapon. Maggie couldn't bring herself to put it away. Every time she walked past, the bold type screamed at her, petition for division of assets. She wanted to call David, demand an explanation, but deep down she already knew what he would say, that the house was half his by right, that she was being unreasonable, that Linda needed space for her own children now. The law was a blunt instrument, and David, with his new wife's encouragement, knew how to wield it. That evening, when Emily came home from campus, Maggie was waiting. She had folded the letter back into its envelope, though the creases betrayed how many times she'd read it. Emily, Maggie began, her voice soft but urgent, we need to talk. Emily sighed, setting her backpack down. About what now? Maggie slid the envelope across the table. Your father is trying to claim half the house. Emily picked it up, scanned it quickly, and shrugged. Well, technically, it is his. He did buy it with you back then. No, Maggie corrected, her voice firming. It was my inheritance from my parents. He contributed nothing. This house was supposed to be ours, yours, and Josh's, a place that belonged to our family. And now, she faltered, her throat tightening, now he wants to take it. Emily looked away, her jaw tight. Maybe he just wants what's fair. Maggie's breath caught. Fair, Emily. I've worked myself sick to keep this house, to keep you in school, to make sure you never had to feel the walls closing in. Emily crossed her arms. And I didn't ask for that. You make it sound like I owe you my life because you chose to sacrifice yours. That's not love, Mom. That's control. The words landed harder than any legal document. Maggie sat frozen, the world tilting beneath her. At that moment, Josh burst into the room, his face red. Don't you dare say that to her. Stay out of this, Emily snapped. No, Josh shot back. You don't get it. She's the one who stayed. She's the one who paid. Dad left. And you? He jabbed a finger toward her. You're running straight into his arms like he's some kind of savior. He's not. He's a liar. Josh, Maggie's voice cracked, desperate to calm the storm. But Emily was already grabbing her bag again. Maybe I'd rather live with a liar than a martyr, she said. Her tone icy, she slung the strap over her shoulder. I'm moving in with Dad. At least there I can breathe. The words seemed to hang in the air long after she slammed the door behind her. The silence that followed was unbearable. Josh sank into a chair, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles went white. Maggie sat opposite him, unable to move, unable to breathe. Mom, Josh whispered finally, his voice breaking. She doesn't mean it, she's just confused. Maggie nodded, though she felt her heart splintering. She stared at the empty seat where Emily had been just moments before. The same girl she had rocked to sleep, bandaged scraped knees for cheered at spelling bees, now walking willingly into the house of the man who had abandoned them. That night, Maggie wandered through the house in the dark, touching the walls, the picture frames, the worn banister on the stairs. Everything here carried her fingerprints, her sweat, her sacrifice. But none of it was enough to keep her daughter from leaving. In her room, she opened an old shoebox tucked beneath the bed. Inside were photos: Emily with missing front teeth grinning at her fifth birthday cake, Josh dressed as a pirate for Halloween, all three of them huddled together on the couch watching movies during snowstorms. She traced Emily's face with her finger, remembering the sound of her daughter's laughter, how once upon a time she had looked at Maggie with nothing but trust. Now that trust was gone. Maggie closed the box gently, her tears falling onto the lid. She whispered into the darkness, "I only ever wanted you to feel safe." But safety was not what Emily wanted anymore. Emily wanted freedom, even if it meant turning away from the mother who had given everything. The next morning, Maggie watched from the window as David's car pulled up in front of the house. Emily came down the stairs with her bags packed. She didn't look at Maggie, didn't offer a goodbye, just a quick, "I'll come back for the rest later." David stood at the curb, arms crossed, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Maggie's chest tightened. She wanted to rush out to pull Emily back inside to beg her not to go, but she stayed rooted in place. Josh stood beside her, fists balled at his sides. "Let her go," he muttered. Maggie nodded, though every instinct screamed against it. As the car pulled away, carrying her daughter farther from the life Maggie had built, she felt something collapse inside her. It was not just the loss of Emily to David's world of polished kitchens and easy promises. It was the realization that love, no matter how deep, could not always hold back the tide of resentment. And for the first time in years, Maggie felt utterly alone, caught between the child who had left her, the child who still needed her, and the house that no longer felt like a home. Josh had never been good at hiding his anger. Even as a boy, his emotions lived on the surface. His joy bright, his sadness heavy, his fury quick. After Emily left with David, that fury simmered just beneath his skin, waiting for the smallest spark. At school, the spark came easily. It was Tuesday afternoon in the cafeteria when a group of boys at the next table started whispering, their voices just loud enough for Josh to hear. "Hey, isn't that Wilson's sister? She ditched their mom to live in a mansion with Daddy Rich." "I heard the mom's broke, works at a diner. Sad man." "Yeah, imagine eating meatloaf every night while Dad's got steak with the new wife." The laughter that followed was sharp, mean, and it cut straight into Josh's chest. He clenched his fists. He could have ignored it, walked away, but the image of his mother standing alone in their kitchen, holding back tears while Emily packed her bags, flared inside him. Before he could think, Josh was on his feet, his tray clattered to the floor. "Say that again," he growled. The boys smirked. "Relax, man, just telling the truth." Josh lunged. The cafeteria erupted. Chairs scraped, kids shouted, a teacher yelled for order. By the time the principal pulled them apart, Josh's knuckles were raw, his lips split, and the whispers had turned into wide-eyed silence. Maggie was called out of her evening shift at the diner. She hurried to the school, apron still tied at her waist, the smell of grease clinging to her hair. In the principal's office, Josh sat with his head down, jaw clenched, a bruise forming along his cheekbone. The principal, a stern woman with glasses perched low on her nose, folded her hands. "Mrs. Wilson, this is serious. Your son assaulted another student. This could result in suspension." Maggie's stomach dropped. "Please, he's a good boy. He just needs to learn control." The principal interrupted. "We cannot allow violence as an answer to words." Maggie glanced at Josh. He refused to meet her eyes. She could see his chest heaving, his hands still trembling. "I understand," Maggie whispered. "It won't happen again." When they left the office, the night air was cold, sharp against her flushed cheeks. She reached for Josh's arm, but he pulled away. "Why did you do it?" she asked softly. Josh finally looked at her. His eyes were wet but burning. Because they were laughing at you, Mom. At us. They think we're pathetic. And Emily, his voice cracked. She left you. Like you weren't enough. I couldn't take it. Maggie's throat tightened. She wanted to tell him not to worry, that she was strong, that words couldn't break her. But that would be a lie. The truth was she felt those words too. Every time she stood behind the counter at the diner in her worn-out shoes, every time she saw the pity in people's eyes when they learned she was alone. She placed a trembling hand on Josh's shoulder. Fighting won't fix it. It's all I can do, he shot back. I'm not smart like Emily. I can't protect you with big words in a courtroom, but I can make them shut up. Maggie pulled him into her arms. For a moment he resisted, then he collapsed against her, his body shaking. I don't want you to get hurt, she whispered into his hair. Not for me. Josh's voice was muffled against her shoulder. Then let me drop out. I'll get a job. I can help with the bills. You won't have to do this alone anymore. The words sliced through her like glass. She pulled back to look at him, her hands gripping his arms. No, absolutely not. You are finishing school. Do you hear me? I won't let you sacrifice your future the way I sacrificed mine. But what if we lose the house? His voice was desperate, almost pleading. What if he takes everything? Maggie swallowed hard, the letter from David flashing in her mind. We won't, she said, though her voice trembled. I'll find a way. Josh studied her face, searching for cracks. Finally he nodded, but the fire in his eyes didn't dim. That night Maggie sat awake at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of cold coffee. The house felt emptier without Emily, the silence thick. Upstairs, Josh's footsteps paced back and forth, restless. She thought of both her children, pulled in opposite directions, one drifting toward the promise of wealth and comfort, the other ready to throw away his own future to shield her. For years, she had believed her sacrifices would protect them, would bind the family together. But now she saw the cruel irony. The very weight she carried had become the wedge driving them apart. She closed her eyes, whispering into the stillness, "Please, let me hold on to them, just a little longer." Outside, the wind rattled the windows. The fortress she had built around her family was crumbling, stone by stone, and she knew the storm was only beginning. 2 days later, another letter arrived. Maggie found it in the mailbox when she came home from her evening shift, the envelope thick and official, the kind that made her stomach tighten before she even tore it open. This one was colder than the last. It was from David's lawyer, outlining the first steps of a formal claim. The language was sterile but merciless. Petitioner seeks equitable division of property assets, including but not limited to the marital residence. Marital residence, that was how they described her home. The walls that had held her children's laughter, the kitchen where she had worked herself ragged to feed them, the bedroom where she had cried in silence after David left, reduced to 2 clinical words on letterhead. Maggie set the paper down on the kitchen table and pressed her hands against her face. She felt Josh watching her from the doorway. "What is it?" he asked. She lowered her hands, forcing her voice steady. "It's from your father's lawyer. He's serious about the house." Josh's eyes darkened. "He can't do that. It's not even his." Maggie wished that were true. She wished the law saw hearts and history, not just signatures and deeds. The next evening, David showed up at her doorstep. He didn't bother calling first. He arrived in his sleek car, Linda beside him, her jewelry catching the porch light. Together, they looked like a glossy magazine picture, success and ease wrapped in expensive fabric. "Hello, Maggie," David said smoothly. "Mind if we come in?" Maggie blocked the doorway. "What do you want?" Linda smiled, the kind of smile that wasn't really a smile at all. "We thought it would be better to talk face to face, for the children's sake." "For the children's sake," Maggie repeated bitterly. "You mean Emily? She's already living with you, isn't she?" Linda's smile widened. "She's very comfortable with us. She'll have every opportunity she deserves." Maggie felt the knife twist. David cleared his throat. "Look, Maggie, there's no reason for this to get ugly. The house is too much for you to handle alone. You're drowning in debt. Everyone can see it. If you just agree to sell, we'll make sure you're taken care of." "Taken care of?" Maggie's voice sharpened. "By the man who hasn't sent a support check in years? By the woman who turned my daughter against me?" Linda's expression flickered, but David kept his tone calm, almost patronizing. "Be reasonable. This house could be a fresh start for us, for Emily, for Diane." Maggie's breath caught. "For Diane?" Linda tilted her head. Didn't David tell you? His sister and her fiancé are looking for a place. This house would be perfect for them once it's sold. Family should help family, don't you think? Maggie's hands trembled on the door frame. For a moment, the world went silent. She pictured Diane, smug and entitled, living in the very rooms Maggie had fought to keep. Her blood ran cold. Josh suddenly appeared behind her. Get out, he said sharply. David blinked. Excuse me? I said get out, Josh repeated, stepping forward, his fists clenched. This is our house, not yours, not hers. Linda laughed softly. What a temper, just like his mother. Maggie pulled Josh back, her body shaking. Go upstairs, she whispered to him, but Josh refused. No, they can't just walk in here and act like we don't matter. David's face hardened. Listen, son, I know you're upset, but this is adult business. You'll understand when you're older. I understand enough, Josh snapped. You left us. You don't get to come back and take what's not yours. The words hung in the air, sharp and true. For a moment, David's mask slipped, anger flickered in his eyes. Linda touched his arm. Let's go, she said smoothly. We've made our point. Before leaving, David looked Maggie straight in the eye. You can fight this if you want, but you won't win. Sooner or later, the house will be ours, and when it is, don't say I didn't give you a chance to do this the easy way. The door closed behind them. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Maggie turned to Josh, her knees weak. He was trembling with rage, his chest heaving. I hate him, Josh whispered. I hate them both. Maggie pulled him into her arms, though her own body shook. She wanted to tell him everything would be fine, that justice would protect them. But the truth pressed down like a weight. She didn't know if she could stop David this time. That night, she sat alone at the kitchen table once again, the letter from the lawyer beside her, the echo of David's words in her ears. She thought of Emily, sleeping soundly under Linda's roof, believing her father's promises. She thought of Josh, ready to throw his fists at the world to defend her. And she thought of herself, caught between two children, two futures, and the crumbling walls of a house that might not be hers much longer. She whispered into the quiet, I will not let him take everything. But even as she said it, she wondered if resolve alone could stand against the machinery of law, money, and betrayal. The morning after David and Linda's visit, Maggie woke with a weight on her chest heavier than any shift at the diner. She lay in bed for a long while, staring at the faded ceiling, listening to Josh's footsteps upstairs as he got ready for school. It wasn't just exhaustion. It was the quiet dread of a battle she wasn't sure she could win. By the time she shuffled into the kitchen, Josh had already left. On the table sat the lawyer's letter, its edges curled from being handled too many times. Maggie shoved it into her purse. She couldn't look at it anymore. Instead, she decided to do something she had put off for years. At the county courthouse, the air smelled faintly of old paper and cleaning supplies. Maggie stood in line at the records office, her palms sweaty as she clutched her driver's license. When it was her turn, she slid a form across the counter. I need copies of child support records for David Wilson. The clerk raised an eyebrow but didn't ask questions. 10 minutes later, Maggie held a stack of documents in her hands. She sat on a wooden bench in the hallway and flipped through them. Her eyes widened. Payment after payment was marked delinquent. Entire years showed nothing but blanks. Thousands upon thousands of dollars David had never paid. Her hands trembled. All those nights she had worked doubles, all those bills she had juggled, the vacations she told her children they couldn't afford. And the whole time, David had left his obligation untouched, unbothered, moving on with his life while she bore the weight alone. Maggie pressed the papers to her chest. For years she had blamed herself for not being enough, for not earning enough, not saving enough, not doing enough. But here, in black and white, was proof. She had never been the failure. David had. That evening, Maggie spread the documents across the kitchen table. Josh hovered nearby, his brow furrowed. What is all this? Evidence, Maggie said quietly. Your father hasn't paid a cent in years. Everything I've carried should have been his responsibility too. Josh's mouth fell open. Then why didn't you ever tell us? Because I didn't want you to hate him, Maggie whispered. I thought maybe one day you'd need him. I didn't want to poison that chance. Josh shook his head. His voice sharp. He poisoned it himself. Before Maggie could answer, her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number lit the screen. She opened it hesitantly. It was Emily. Mom, I know you're angry, but I need you to stop fighting Dad. Linda says you're making this harder than it has to be. Dad just wants what's fair. Please don't ruin things. Maggie stared at the words, her stomach churning. She typed back slowly, her fingers stiff. Emily, I found proof. Your father hasn't paid child support in years. All this time I've been carrying it alone. Ask him about it. Look at the court records yourself. The dots appeared on the screen, then vanished. Minutes passed. Finally, another message came through. Linda told me you'd say that. She said you'd try to turn me against them. I don't know what to believe anymore. Maggie's heart broke. She could almost hear her daughter's voice, caught between two worlds, being pulled by promises on one side and love on the other. She sent one final text. Believe the truth, Emily. It's all there in writing. I kept quiet for too long, but you deserve to know what kind of man your father really is. Late that night, as Maggie gathered the documents into a folder, she caught sight of something else in the stack, emails attached to the court file. Correspondence between David's lawyer and Linda. One line froze her blood. Emily should stay with us permanently. The more distance she has from her mother, the easier it will be to finalize the property transfer. Maggie sank into a chair, her knees weak. Linda hadn't just welcomed Emily, she had orchestrated it. She had pulled her daughter away, piece by piece, until Maggie stood alone. Her tears came hot and fast, spilling onto the paper. She whispered into the silence, "What are they turning you into, Emily?" She pressed her hands flat against the table, the truth spread out before her. David's lies, Linda's manipulation, Emily's distance. For years, Maggie had carried her burden alone, believing silence was strength. But now silence was no longer an option. The truth was out, and it was the only weapon she had left. And for the first time in a long while, Maggie felt a flicker of something dangerous, something stronger than despair. The rain began just after sunset, a steady drizzle that soon hardened into sheets against the windows. Maggie sat at the kitchen table with the folder of documents spread in front of her, listening to the storm pound the roof. Josh was upstairs doing homework, though every so often she heard him pacing. Her phone lay silent beside her. She had half hoped Emily might write again, half feared it too. The last message still sat there, accusing, doubtful. "Linda told me you'd say that." Maggie pressed her palms against her eyes. She had always believed that the truth would speak for itself, that proof on paper would be enough. But what if it wasn't? What if Emily never believed her? A sudden knock rattled the front door. Maggie's heart jumped. At this hour in this weather, visitors were rare. She stood and opened the door slowly. Emily stood on the porch, soaked through, her hair plastered to her cheeks. Behind her, the rain streaked like silver chains under the porch light. "Emily," Maggie whispered. Her daughter's eyes were red-rimmed, her expression a storm to match the one outside. "Can I come in?" Maggie stepped aside wordlessly. Emily dropped her wet backpack by the door and walked into the living room. The sound of the rain filled the silence between them. Finally, Maggie spoke. "What happened?" Emily's jaw tightened. "I had a fight with Linda." The name was bitter in Maggie's mouth. "About what?" "About you." Emily's voice cracked. She sank onto the couch, hugging herself. "She kept saying you're manipulative, that you'd drag me down with you. I told her to stop. She didn't, so I left." Maggie's chest ached. She moved closer, but Emily held up a hand. "Don't, please, I need to say this." The room fell still except for the hammering rain. "Mom," Emily began, her voice trembling, "do you have any idea what it feels like to grow up watching you kill yourself for us? To see you come home dead tired every night, to see you never buy anything for yourself, never smile like you mean it? It felt like we were a burden you had to carry." Maggie's breath caught. "You were never a burden, you were my life." "But that's the problem," Emily burst out. "I don't want to be someone's whole life. I don't want that responsibility on my shoulders. I don't want to look at my future and see your sacrifices chained to it." Her words struck deep, sharper even than before. Maggie felt them twist inside her chest. Yet there was no cruelty in Emily's voice this time, only pain. Slowly, Maggie sat opposite her daughter. Her hands trembled as she reached for the folder on the table. "Emily, I need you to see something." She pulled out the child support records and laid them out. "All these years, I worked myself raw because your father never paid what he owed. I stayed silent because I wanted you to love him. I wanted you to have at least one parent you could look up to. But silence only made you believe I was the problem." Emily stared at the papers, her brow furrowed. Is this real? It's court records, Maggie said softly. Every skipped payment, every month he left us to fend for ourselves. I didn't want you to carry that truth, but maybe I was wrong. Maybe you needed to know. For a long moment, Emily said nothing. She traced the columns of numbers with her finger, her lips pressed tight. The storm outside thundered, rattling the windows. Finally, her voice broke. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Maggie's eyes filled. Because I thought protecting you meant keeping you in the dark, but all it did was build this wall between us. She reached across the table, her hand hovering over Emily's. I'm sorry. Emily's shoulders shook. She pressed her hands to her face, sobbing. I thought you wanted to control me. I thought you didn't want me to live my own life, and I hated you for it. Maggie slid beside her and wrapped her arms around her daughter, rainwater still dampening Emily's sweater. I never wanted to chain you. I only wanted to keep you safe. For the first time in months, Emily didn't pull away. She leaned into her mother's arms, trembling with the weight of everything she had held inside. Upstairs, Josh stood in the hallway, listening. He had crept halfway down the stairs when he heard Emily's voice break, and now he leaned against the banister, his eyes burning. For so long, he had carried anger in his fists. Now, hearing his sister's sobs and his mother's whispered comfort, something softer stirred in him. The storm outside raged on, but inside the small house, another storm had finally broken, not in destruction, but in release. And though Maggie knew the battles with David were far from over, in that moment, holding her daughter close, she felt the first fragile crack in the wall of silence begin to mend. The courthouse smelled of polished wood and old coffee. Maggie had been here once before years ago, during the divorce, but this time felt different. Back then she had been broken, scared, signing papers with shaking hands. Today she carried a folder thick with evidence, and for the first time in a long time she wasn't alone. Emily walked beside her, shoulders squared, jaw tight. She hadn't said much since that stormy night, but the way she had sat with Maggie at the kitchen table, flipping through the child support records, had been enough. Her silence wasn't distance now, it was determination. Josh trailed behind them, restless in the stiff hallway, his fists jammed into his pockets. He was too young to testify, but he refused to stay home. I need to be here, he had told his mother, and Maggie hadn't argued. When they entered the courtroom, David was already seated at the defendant's table, wearing a crisp navy suit, his tie perfectly knotted. Beside him, Linda leaned close, whispering in his ear, her manicured hand resting on his sleeve like a badge of ownership. Maggie's heart tightened. For years she had let David's presence make her feel small. Today she straightened her spine. She would not bow to him again. The judge, a woman with silver hair pulled back in a bun, entered with a commanding presence. Court is now in session. David's lawyer launched first, his voice slick and confident. Your Honor, my client seeks only what is rightfully his. The marital residence, though currently occupied by Mrs. Wilson, is a shared asset. Equity demands division. Maggie's lawyer, a steady, soft-spoken man recommended by a friend, rose calmly. With respect, Your Honor, the house was purchased using inheritance funds from Mrs. Wilson's late parents. Mr. Wilson has contributed nothing toward its mortgage or upkeep since the divorce. Furthermore, we present evidence of delinquent child support payments totaling over $80,000. A ripple moved through the courtroom. Maggie could feel Linda stiffen across the aisle. The lawyer slid the records forward. These are official court documents. For over a decade, Mr. Wilson neglected his legal obligation, while Mrs. Wilson shouldered the full burden of raising their children. To claim entitlement to her home now is not equity, it is exploitation. David shifted in his seat. His jaw tightened, but his lawyer pressed on. Those records don't erase the fact that his name was once tied to the property. He is entitled to his share. Emily stood suddenly. That's not true. The judge glanced up, surprised. And you are? Emily Wilson, their daughter. Her voice trembled but held firm. I know I'm not supposed to speak, but I need to. My mother has carried everything. Every late bill, every night shift, every sacrifice, while my father, she faltered, her eyes flicking to David. While he gave nothing, he doesn't deserve our house. He doesn't deserve any of it. The judge studied her for a long moment before nodding. Your statement is noted. Maggie reached for Emily's hand under the table, giving it a squeeze. When it was David's turn to speak, his mask cracked. I provided in other ways, he insisted, voice rising. Opportunities, guidance. Guidance? Maggie's lawyer cut in, his tone sharper than before. Did you guide your children when you abandoned financial responsibility? Did you guide them by letting your new wife manipulate their loyalties? Linda gasped. That's outrageous. But David snapped, slamming a hand on the table. You think she deserves to keep everything while I get nothing? She turned my kids against me. The judge banged her gavel once. Enough, this is not a place for shouting matches. Silence fell heavy. David's shoulders sagged for the first time. He looked less like a polished attorney and more like a desperate man. Hours later, after arguments, counterarguments, and the weary shuffle of paperwork, the judge delivered her decision. This court recognizes the property in question was purchased through inheritance funds belonging solely to Margaret Wilson. Furthermore, due to Mr. Wilson's substantial failure to fulfill child support obligations, this court rules in favor of Mrs. Wilson. The marital residence shall remain in her possession. Mr. Wilson's claim is hereby denied. The gavel struck. Maggie's knees nearly buckled with relief. Emily exhaled, tears glistening in her eyes. Josh grinned for the first time in weeks, his fists unclenching at last. Across the aisle, David's face turned ashen. Linda leaned away from him, her smile gone, her eyes cold with disappointment. Maggie gathered her papers slowly, deliberately, refusing to rush. When she finally stood, she looked David in the eye. For years, she had been the one shrinking under his shadow. Today, she saw clearly, it was he who had been small all along. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun broke through the clouds, scattering golden light across the steps. Maggie stood with her children at her side, Emily on one hand, Josh on the other. For the first time in a long time, she felt the weight on her shoulders ease. The fight wasn't over. There would be more battles, legal, emotional, financial, but the tide had shifted. And as she looked at her children, bruised but unbroken, she felt something she hadn't in years. David did not take defeat quietly. For weeks after the ruling, he launched every attempt to appeal, sending more papers through his lawyer, grasping for any technicality that might overturn the verdict. But the evidence of his neglect was too strong, the record of his debts too damning. Each motion was denied in turn. Linda's patience thinned. Rumors trickled through town that she had begun spending less time at David's side, her bright smile curdling into disdain. Maggie heard from a neighbor that Linda had been spotted at a cafe with another man, her hand resting casually on his. One evening, as Maggie folded laundry in the living room, Emily sat down beside her with her phone. On the screen was a social media post, a picture of Linda at a charity gala, standing with someone else, her arm linked through his. No David. Dad doesn't know how to keep anything together, Emily whispered. Maggie folded another towel slowly. She didn't gloat. She didn't need to. Life had a way of showing its truths. Emily had begun coming home more often since the court case. At first, it was just to visit Josh or to grab some of her things. Then she started lingering, staying for dinner, working on her laptop at the kitchen table. One Saturday, she surprised Maggie by cooking breakfast, her hair tied up, her eyes softer than they'd been in months. As they sat eating pancakes, Emily cleared her throat. Mom, I owe you an apology. Maggie looked up, startled. I didn't see it before. I thought your sacrifices were suffocating, but now I get it. You weren't trying to chain me, you were trying to free me from the mistakes Dad made, from the weight you carried alone, and I turned that into resentment. Her voice shook. I'm sorry. Maggie reached across the table, covering her daughter's hand. You don't have to be sorry, you just have to live differently, stronger, wiser. Emily's eyes filled. I will, because of you? Josh smirked across the table, shoving another bite of pancake into his mouth. About time you admitted Mom's the hero. For the first time in months, laughter filled the kitchen. It was small, fragile, but real. David's collapse accelerated. His law firm, embarrassed by his behavior, quietly pushed him out. Without Linda's money or influence, he struggled to keep his image afloat. The man who once arrived at Maggie's door in tailored suits was now spotted driving an old sedan, his hair unkempt, his shoulders hunched. One afternoon, as Maggie left the grocery store, she saw him standing by his car, fumbling with a bag of discount food. For a moment, their eyes met. He looked away first. Maggie drove home in silence, her chest tight. Once she would have felt pity. Now she only felt distance, as if he belonged to another life, another story entirely. At home, things were slowly shifting. Josh, inspired by the courtroom fight, poured himself into schoolwork with renewed focus. If Emily's going to be a lawyer, maybe I'll be an architect, he announced one evening, sketching plans for a house on scrap paper. I'll build you a new one someday, Mom, one nobody can ever take. Maggie smiled, her throat tightening with pride. This house is enough, Josh, but I'd love to see what you build. Meanwhile, Emily threw herself into her law studies with a new purpose. She often asked Maggie questions late into the night about perseverance, about justice, about what it means to stand your ground when the world is against you. You'd make a better professor than half my teachers, Emily said one night. I'm just a waitress, Maggie replied softly. No, Emily said firmly. You're the reason I'll be a lawyer. The children had been planning something quietly. Maggie suspected nothing until her 50th birthday arrived. She came home from work to find the house lit with candles, the smell of cake filling the air. Surprise! Josh shouted, nearly dropping a balloon in his excitement. Emily stood beside him, holding a cake frosted with uneven letters. Happy 50, Mom. Maggie pressed a hand to her mouth. You too. We wanted to remind you, Emily said, her eyes shining, that you're not alone, not anymore. Josh grinned. Besides, 50 looks good on you. Maggie laughed through her tears as they pulled her to the table. They sang loudly, off-key, and when she blew out the candles, she didn't wish for money or rest or even peace. She wished simply to keep this warmth, this fragile closeness, alive. Later that night, after the dishes were washed and Josh had gone upstairs, Maggie sat on the porch with Emily. The air was cool, stars scattered above. I used to think my life was just sacrifice, Maggie said quietly, that I'd given everything away. But tonight, I feel like maybe it wasn't wasted. Maybe it was the seed for something new. Emily leaned her head on her mother's shoulder. It was. And I promise we'll make sure you don't have to carry it all anymore. For the first time in years, Maggie let herself believe it. The house was still modest, the bills still stacked high. But the cracks in her family were healing piece by piece. And in the ruins of David's greed and betrayal, something stronger was being rebuilt. Not wealth, not luxury, but love that had been tested and had survived. Maggie looked out at the night sky, her daughter's head resting against her, and whispered to herself, this is what rebirth feels like. A year passed like the slow unfurling of spring after a long, hard winter. The Wilson house, once a place of tension and silence, now breathed differently. The walls that had echoed with slammed doors and hushed arguments were filled again with laughter, music, and late-night conversations over tea. The storm had not just passed, it had reshaped them all. Emily graduated law school in May. She crossed the stage in her black robe, her name called clearly, and for one brief moment she looked straight into the crowd where Maggie sat. Their eyes met, and Maggie felt tears blur her vision. It was not just pride, it was vindication. Every late shift, every aching step, every lonely night had brought them to this moment. When the ceremony ended, Emily found her mother in the throng of parents and students. She wrapped her arms around Maggie so tightly that Maggie almost couldn't breathe. I did this because of you, Emily whispered. No, Maggie said softly. You did this because of you. I only showed you where the path began. Josh stood nearby, taller now, a man emerging from the boy he had been. He grinned and threw an arm around them both. Don't forget me, I'm next. His voice was full of confidence, the fire inside him no longer reckless but steady, directed. He had already been accepted into a university architecture program, and he carried his sketches everywhere like treasures. Maggie looked at her two children and felt something she hadn't in decades: lightness. As for David, his world unraveled further. Linda left him quietly, without ceremony. Word spread that she had married someone else within the year. David's law license was suspended for failure to meet obligations. When Maggie glimpsed him once at the grocery store, his shoulders slumped, his suit worn at the edges, he avoided her gaze. For the first time, she felt no sting, only detachment. His story was no longer hers to carry. Maggie's own life blossomed in unexpected ways. With Emily and Josh encouraging her, she finally took a leap of faith. She had always loved baking, recipes passed down from her mother, pages smudged with flour and sugar. With their help, she turned that love into a small neighborhood bakery. The sign above the door read, Second Chances. Every morning, the smell of fresh bread and cinnamon rolls drifted through the air. Customers came not only for the food, but for the warmth Maggie carried in her smile. She was no longer only the woman who sacrificed. She was the woman who had rebuilt, who had turned loss into sustenance. On quiet evenings, she sat on the bakery's small patio, watching the sunset, her children often beside her. They teased her about the flour dust in her hair. She teased them about leaving dishes in the sink. Ordinary moments, simple moments, but to Maggie, they were everything. One night, after a long day at the bakery, Maggie sat on the porch of her home, looking out at the stars. Emily was inside, reading law journals. Josh was sketching designs at the kitchen table. The house was alive with the hum of possibility. She thought of the woman she had been, a mother defined by silence, sacrifice, and fear of losing it all. And she thought of the woman she had become, still a mother, still sacrificing, but no longer diminished by it. Now she carried her love not as a weight, but as a flame. Maggie whispered to herself, almost like a prayer, "We survived, and we became more." Dear friends, if you have walked with me through this story, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. Life is not easy. Families are messy, full of heartbreak and healing, silence and song. But love, real love, always has the power to rebuild, even after the darkest storms. I hope this story has reminded you of your own strength and of the bonds that truly matter. May your days be filled with health, may your families know peace, and may your homes, however humble, always be filled with laughter. Take care of yourselves and hold close the people you love. With gratitude, Maggie.